Part 1. Why winters in Victorian-era London were brutal. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Tonight, we begin with a story that is less about crowns and coronations, and more about, well, frozen noses. So, settle in, dim the lights, and maybe grab a blanket, because we're going to float through the chilly streets of Victorian London. And when I say chilly, I mean really, really chilly. Like, you'll wish you were a Habsburg potato chilly. Now, London in the 19th century was special. It had its fog, its cobblestone streets, and that unique, lingering aroma of coal smoke mixed with a hint of, let's call it, river aroma. Imagine a city that is, on most days, gray enough to make you question your life choices, and then layer on winter that seems to have been designed specifically to test human patience, sanity, and the structural integrity of top hats. The Victorians were optimistic, in a sort of slightly deluded way. They built massive factories, crammed families into narrow row houses, and every winter collectively pretended that shivering was a sign of moral fortitude, because nothing says progress like frostbite as a character-building exercise. Of course, when winter came, it didn't just bring cold, it brought problems. All sorts of tiny, grinding problems that slowly made life mildly miserable. Streets turned into rivers of slush and then into rivers of ice. The Thames, which is today mostly a gentle, if slightly sad river, was back then a frothy, polluted behemoth. During the coldest winters, it froze over enough for people to think, sure, let's walk on this, because why not add a touch of danger to our day? And occasionally, yes, they did hold ice fairs on the river. Imagine going to a fair on a frozen sewage river. Sounds fun. Now, the coal situation. Londoners relied on coal to heat their homes, which seems reasonable, except that nobody really had a concept of ventilation. So rooms were simultaneously hot, smoky, and full of soot. Breathing was optional, but the black layer on furniture was mandatory. And if you were poor, which was, let's face it, the majority of people, your coal supply was limited. So the average Londoner spent winter in a state of hopeful freezing. There were also these tiny, charming Victorian houses with their open fireplaces. Open, yes, and inefficient, yes. Imagine a fire that could barely keep a room at a tolerable temperature while you simultaneously inhaled what was basically a smoky machine. Now, if you were wealthy, you had more coal, more rooms, and servants who would keep your feet warm. But the poor, they had cold, damp, and the occasional rat visiting to judge your life choices. Let's float over to another quirk of Victorian winter. Clothing. Oh, the clothing. Layer upon layer of heavy wool, corsets for women, stiff collars for men, top hats that could double as small storage units. People looked fancy, sure, but warm? Not really. They moved slowly, like slightly annoyed penguins, trying to navigate icy streets while avoiding horse-drawn carriages that didn't really stop for pedestrians. And if you slipped, well, it was a polite way of saying you'd now have a very fashionable bruise. Food was another story. In the winter, fresh produce was a luxury because refrigeration was mostly a dream, so diets became bleak. Root vegetables, salted meats, and whatever else could survive months in the cold without crying about it. Victorian cookbooks often suggest subtle variations on cabbage, potatoes, and more cabbage. And, of course, gruel. Gruel was popular. It was nutritious-ish, filling-ish, and about as comforting as a damp handkerchief. And then the diseases. Because cold weather, cramped houses, and poor nutrition are all excellent ingredients for respiratory infections. People caught colds, influenza, and something called consumption, which is just a polite way of saying tuberculosis. In short, winter was basically a long, unbroken trial of minor illnesses that might escalate if you weren't careful, or rich. Hospitals existed, but they were crowded and underfunded, so a trip there was rarely a delightful escape. Now, here's where it gets really interesting: the architecture. Victorian Londoners loved their tall, narrow buildings. Charming from the outside, somewhat tragic inside when it came to warmth. Hate rises, yes, but with only one small fireplace per floor, the top rooms were marginally better and the bottom rooms were ice boxes. And if you had a family of 6 living in a 2-room flat, winter was like a slow communal endurance challenge. The social aspect is worth mentioning. Outdoor life didn't stop entirely in winter because, well, people had to work. Coal miners, dock workers, chimney sweeps, street vendors, they all continued their duties while battling wind, snow, and the occasional surprise horse. And yes, children often ran errands or delivered newspapers in conditions that would get you immediately sued today. But the Victorians considered this character building, which is historically accurate, but morally questionable. Now, the smog deserves its own quiet moment. Victorian London had an affection for burning everything, mostly coal, but also wood, peat, and occasionally optimism. In winter, the air turned into something called pea soup fog. Literally. It was thick, greenish, and sometimes acidic enough to corrode clothing or mildly panic your lungs. Visibility was so low that accidents were common, and navigation became a slow, cautious shuffle. People sometimes carried sticks or long umbrellas to poke ahead, like low-budget wizards in a smoky apocalypse. Even the wealthy suffered, in their own way. Imagine having a mansion with 100 rooms, all cold, all drafty, and staff too busy keeping themselves alive to fuss over the central heating. They wore furs indoors, had extra fireplaces, and occasionally tried ridiculous heating contraptions that sometimes backfired. But compared to a poor family in a slum alley, their suffering was, well, slightly more luxurious. And here's a bit of fun irony. Victorians loved to write about the joys of London in winter. Cards by the fire, sledding in parks, brisk walks through fog, all of which is charming if you have gaslighting levels of optimism, or at least enough warm clothing. Otherwise, the reality was slightly less poetic. Frostbitten toes, soot-covered faces, and very tired people shuffling through mud. Speaking of frostbite, let's not forget about water supply. Plumbing was primitive. Many houses had no running water, and fetching it from pumps or wells in sub-zero temperatures was unpleasant. Water would freeze in pipes, containers, and, if you were unlucky, in your hands. Baths were rare, mostly because the effort of heating enough water outweighed the moral benefits of cleanliness. So winter had a subtle way of making life grimy and cold at the same time. Now, let's meander toward transportation. Streets were often rivers of ice and slush, and horse-drawn carriages were everywhere. Not only did you have to dodge traffic, but the horses themselves occasionally left behind, well, gifts, which in the freezing cold became a rather unremarkable part of daily life. Sidewalks were treacherous, carriage drivers were grumpy, and street lamps were dim at best. Night fell early, so people got used to tripping over things in darkness. And then there were the public institutions. Schools, churches, markets, they continued operation through the cold. Kids would sit on wooden benches in rooms barely warmer than outside. Clergy preached while wearing multiple layers of wool. Shopkeepers greeted customers with red, numb fingers in the occasional sneeze. Every public space had this air of, we are surviving, not thriving, which is both a historical fact and an excellent mood setter for winter storytelling. And finally, let's not forget the simple joy of coal shortages. Every winter, the price of coal would spike. Families would economize. One fireplace, minimal coal, rationed warmth. People got creative, wearing extra layers indoors, huddling together, or simply pretending the cold wasn't happening. It was, in short, a slow collective endurance exercise that everyone was forced to participate in. And yes, sometimes it killed people, but mostly it just made life briskly unpleasant in a way the Victorians accepted with ironic stoicism. So, as we drift through this frosty Victorian London, let's pause to imagine the scene. Fog curling through narrow streets, chimneys coughing coal smoke into the sky, children running errands with frozen noses, adults sighing through the cold, and everyone— Part 2. Victorian Survival Tactics and Eccentric Heating Habits. Welcome back, friends. If you're still cozy under that blanket or imagining yourself shuffling through foggy London streets, you're in the right frame of mind. Tonight, we drift a little deeper into the ways Victorians tried and often failed to survive winter without succumbing entirely to frostbite, soot inhalation, or the mild existential dread that accompanies sub-zero temperatures. Let's begin with clothing. Because, of course, in Victorian times, survival depended less on science and more on elaborate layering systems that could double as furniture. Men wore heavy wool trousers, stiff collars, and, in the coldest weather, overcoats that could probably have doubled as small tents. Gloves were essential, though they were often fingerless, which, in retrospect, is a choice that made typing today slightly more feasible but left people with very chilly fingertips back then. Women, meanwhile, had an entire winter wardrobe ritual. Corsets, multiple petticoats, wool skirts, shawls, scarves, gloves, and fur. And yet, somehow, all that warmth still wasn't enough. Victorian women often suffered from chill-related fainting, which is basically what happens when your body says, yes, you are overdressed and underheated at the same time. Congratulations! And if you were wealthy, you could layer silk over wool and still complain about being cold in your private carriage. Class inequality even affected frostbite. And the hats. Oh, the hats. Men had tall hats that were tall, rigid, and occasionally useful as impromptu storage for newspapers or small pets, if one were inclined to test Victorian fashion extremes. Women had elaborate bonnets, often lined with fur or ribbons, which did a fine job of keeping the head warm while simultaneously making it impossible to see through fog. Fashion, as always, won over practicality, but at least the Victorians looked stylish while shivering. Inside the homes, survival relied on heating ingenuity. Fireplaces were central, of course, but Victorians didn't stop at simple flames. Wealthy families experimented with elaborate contraptions. Some had early versions of central heating, powered by hot water or steam pipes, a luxury bordering on magical. Others relied on multiple fireplaces, connected to a series of ducts, which occasionally produced more smoke than heat. One can imagine a servant standing in a hallway, waving a towel to disperse smoke, while thinking, I'm fairly sure this isn't how we were supposed to survive winter. For the middle class, heating was a patchwork affair. Cast iron stoves were popular. They could radiate heat into a single room, provided you had enough coal. But if you ran out, or if your stove developed a leak, you might wake up to find the room's temperature had dropped to something approximating the inside of the Thames in January. The poor, of course, had minimal heating options. Often a single small fireplace sufficed for an entire family, and keeping it fueled was a winter-long negotiation with the local coal merchant. Water heating was also a challenge. Water wasn't delivered via pipes, it had to be boiled. Baths were rare, particularly in winter, because heating enough water for a family was a multi-hour ordeal. Children were sometimes bathed once a week or less, and adults occasionally improvised with sponge baths near the fire. Hygiene was a subtle casualty of cold weather, though the Victorians weren't particularly troubled by it. Soap and water existed, but convenience did not. Let's talk food for a moment. The winter diet was, shall we say, uninspired. Fresh fruits and vegetables were expensive imports, so most families relied on root vegetables, salted or smoked meats, and bread. The wealthy had access to slightly more exciting dishes, though these were often heavily spiced and overly complicated, because if you had enough money to survive winter comfortably, you also had time to invent new ways to be mildly pretentious about it. And then there were the Victorian winter rituals. Things that were charming if you were upper class, mildly amusing if you were middle class, and inconvenient if you were poor. Ice skating on the frozen Thames became something of a spectacle during extremely cold winters. People built temporary ice rinks on city ponds, and occasionally there were frost fairs where vendors sold goods, performers entertained, and everyone collectively ignored the fact that they were standing on frozen, semi-polluted river water. It was socially acceptable to treat frostbite as a badge of honor. Transportation, of course, didn't stop for winter. Horse-drawn carriages plodded through slushy streets, and omnibuses continued their routes despite ice, snow, and the occasional pile of frozen horse waste. If you were walking, you risked slipping on icy cobblestones, colliding with carriages, or being slightly flattened by a horse that was also trying to survive winter. It was not exactly a relaxing commute, but it was a routine challenge that everyone accepted with Victorian stoicism. Medical understanding at the time was limited. Cold-related ailments were often blamed on weak constitutions or poor moral fiber. Doctors recommended layers of clothing, lots of soup, and sometimes mild bleeding or purging, which, in hindsight, probably did more harm than good. But hey, at least someone was doing something. Modern medicine, with its cozy hospitals and central heating, had yet to arrive. Now let's drift into the domestic eccentricities of winter survival. Wealthy Victorians in particular had a taste for elaborate heating devices. Foot warmers, for example, were small metal boxes filled with hot coals, designed to sit under tables or at the foot of beds. They were portable, relatively safe, and occasionally ignited small fires in carpets. Tabletop braziers, hot bricks, and even heated stones in beds were common. One can imagine a family clustered around a brazier in a drawing room, sipping tea and silently judging the poor for their inadequate heating arrangements. And pets were not exempt from winter discomfort. Dogs, cats, and exotic animals sometimes received their own miniature heaters or blankets. Monkeys, if kept as pets, were bundled up like tiny Victorian children, and birds might have cages positioned near stoves. It was a strange slow-motion ballet of warmth distribution. The psychological impact of winter deserves attention. Extended periods of gray, foggy weather led to what might be politely called winter melancholy. People felt lethargic, irritable, and occasionally resigned to the idea that survival itself was enough of an achievement. Writers and poets romanticized foggy winters in their work, of course, but for the average Londoner, it was less poetry and more endurance. And the social rituals reflected that endurance. People visited neighbors less because braving the cold streets was unpleasant. Indoor gatherings became more common, often centered around fireplaces or stoves. Card games, knitting, and long conversations filled the hours, accompanied by tea or warming spirits. Drinking was socially acceptable, partly as a warming measure, and partly because one can only endure so much gray before mild inebriation seems like an improvement. Let's meander over to public spaces. Churches and schools had to operate despite cold temperatures. Children sat on wooden benches in poorly heated classrooms, while teachers wrapped themselves in layers and tried to maintain the illusion of productivity. Clergy preached in drafty churches, warming their hands with gloves or huddling near small stoves. The wealthy, meanwhile, attended winter balls and social gatherings in equally cold rooms, wrapped in furs and accompanied by servants whose main job was to keep the hosts at least marginally comfortable. And yes, the Thames itself played a role in winter survival. or mild inconvenience depending on your perspective. In extreme winters, it froze enough to allow walking across or holding markets on the ice. It was simultaneously thrilling, terrifying, and slightly gross. Ice skating became a recreational activity, but always with the faint background anxiety of thin ice and a long, cold swim in polluted water. People accepted this because entertainment options in winter were limited, and danger added a subtle spice to otherwise tedious cold months. And lastly, let's briefly touch on mortality. Winter in Victorian London was not immediately fatal for most, but it did subtly, relentlessly erode health. Poor nutrition, damp housing, and cold exposure contributed to a range of illnesses. Tuberculosis thrived, pneumonia crept in. Children and the elderly were particularly vulnerable. Yet, society largely considered this acceptable. Survival was a mark of resilience, and mild suffering was socially respectable. So, as we drift through this image of Victorian London, consider the cumulative effect. Fog curling around narrow streets, coal smoke obscuring the sun, children running errands with frozen noses, adults improvising heating contraptions, and everyone collectively enduring. Winter wasn't just cold, it was a social, economic, and psychological gauntlet. It was a season of subtle suffering, quiet innovation, and relentless adaptation. And with that, we can gently glide toward the next part, where we'll explore the personal lives of specific Victorian families, their quirky winter habits, and how even the elites were not immune to frostbite, frozen toes, or the psychological trials of the season. For now, sip your warm drink, pull your blanket a little closer, and imagine the gray, smoky, cold streets of London filled with people doing their best not to shiver too loudly. Part 3. Victorian Families, Quirks, and Winter Woes. Welcome back, friends. By now, you're probably comfortably ensconced in a blanket, or at least imagining that you are, and that's perfect, because we're about to float deeper into Victorian life, not just the streets or the weather, but the people who endured it. And by people, I mostly mean families, whose winter survival strategies ranged from ingenious to mildly absurd. Let's start with the middle-class household. Picture a family of 6 in a 2-room flat, sharing a single fireplace. The father is trying to read the morning paper, which is slightly damp from condensation, while the mother stirs gruel and occasionally reprimands the children for being too noisy for frostbite. Children wore multiple layers, even indoors, often leading to a situation where they resembled small wool-covered sausages rolling about the room. Heat was precious, and movement was limited. Less for laziness, more because every step away from the fire was a slow slide into cold misery. Meals were brief, functional, and served to maintain body temperature rather than delight taste buds. Root vegetables dominated. Occasionally, salted meat appeared, though it was generally tough enough to double as a doorstop. Tea was a highlight, because hot liquid is always welcome in a room that feels like a poorly insulated cave. Families gathered close to the fire, huddling, whispering, and occasionally fighting over who got the slightly warmer spot. Victorian domestic winter life, in short, was a quiet endurance contest. Wealthier families fared better, but not by much. They had multiple fireplaces, layers of carpets, and servants to manage stoves and hot water. And yet the cold still crept in. Large houses were difficult to heat evenly. Upper rooms were often a degree or two warmer than the ground floor, but hallways remained icy, and drafts were a constant companion. The more rooms you had, the more places for cold to hide. One can imagine a house so large that members needed small foot warmers just to traverse the corridors safely. These practices were considered entirely reasonable, if slightly awkward. Let's float over to royalty, because even crowns don't protect you from frostbite. Queen Victoria herself, for instance, had an entire suite of winter clothing designed for indoor and outdoor use. She wore furs, thick woolens, and multiple layers beneath her dresses, yet still complained about the cold. Her palaces, sprawling and beautiful, were drafty. Fireplaces worked in some rooms, while others remained unheated, and servants were often busy just ensuring the queen had enough warmth to remain regal. The royal children, of course, were not exempt. They wore layers, thick socks, and often had small heated pads in their beds. Education and play continued in spite of winter, which meant children shivering over lessons, drawing exercises, and occasional piano practice. Illness was common, even among the privileged. It turns out that cold rooms, poor ventilation, and multiple siblings in close proximity are a recipe for winter colds and mild fevers, which is slightly ironic, given that royalty was supposed to be protected by status and wealth. And royals had their eccentricities. Prince Albert, for example, had a fascination with heating systems and would sometimes supervise stove maintenance personally. He was also meticulous about winter attire, insisting that gloves, scarves, and hats be arranged precisely. Visitors might have found it mildly obsessive, but in a house where the temperatures sometimes dipped below tolerable levels, it was entirely practical. Let's drift toward children's entertainment. Sledding, skating, and outdoor play continued in winter, but always with a layer of caution. Frostbite was a real concern. Children were bundled in multiple layers, sometimes making movement difficult. Outdoor games had to be short because prolonged exposure to the cold could ruin toes and fingers. And yet play persisted because cold was a fact of life, and boredom was worse. Parents watched from windows, muffled behind curtains, occasionally muttering advice or threats about returning inside before hypothermia set in. Pets, too, were bundled up. Cats and dogs sometimes wore tiny wool coats. Wealthy families had elaborate heated pet beds. Monkeys and birds were tucked near stoves. It was all part of the Victorian belief that warmth was essential, dignity was optional, and eccentricity was entirely normal. The social calendar also adapted. Winter balls, dinners, and gatherings were sometimes held in freezing rooms with attendees dressed in layers of finery. Conversation often included subtle complaints about drafts, awkward positioning near heaters, and debates about who got the most comfortable chair. These events were social rituals, but they also functioned as communal coping mechanisms for enduring the cold. Medical advice, as usual, was a mix of practical and mildly peculiar. Doctors recommended layers, hot drinks, moderate exercise, and avoidance of sudden exposure to cold. Some advised slightly less conventional practices, wrapping oneself in flannel, placing warm stones near beds, or using foot baths before bedtime. These methods varied in effectiveness, but they demonstrate how Victorians actively sought solutions to what was essentially a long, gray endurance test. Let's pause to consider daily routines. Morning hygiene, for instance, was a challenge. Cold water was often the only option, and few houses had heated baths. Children were sometimes splashed briefly to maintain basic cleanliness, while adults improvised sponge baths or delayed washing until temperatures rose. Grooming, clothing, and breakfast all became slower, more deliberate acts as families navigated cold rooms, frozen water, and stiff fingers. One can't ignore the psychological dimension. Winter fog, short days, and gray skies contributed to subtle melancholy. Letters, diaries, and memoirs from the era frequently mention lethargy, mild irritability, and a pervasive sense of enduring rather than thriving. Entertainment, reading, indoor games, or music helped, but it could not fully offset the persistent damp chill that seemed to seep into bones and furniture alike. Even food preparation was affected. Cooking relied on stoves or fireplaces, which sometimes doubled as heating sources. Meals were functional, warming, and often repetitive. Root vegetables, soups, and porridge dominated. The rich might enjoy roasted meats and elaborate puddings, but the cold still complicated meal preparation. Frozen ingredients, slow cooking times, and drafty kitchens all contributed to a mild winter slog that everyone, rich or poor, silently endured. And then there were the small daily dangers, slipping on ice, minor burns from stoves, and the occasional mishap with coal. Life required vigilance,
patience, and a willingness to accept discomfort as a standard part of the season. Parents taught children strategies for survival, servants coordinated heating, and everyone collectively practiced what might politely be called endurance winterism. In summary, the Victorian family's experience of winter was a mix of careful preparation, eccentric habits, and social rituals, all underpinned by a resigned acceptance of mild suffering. Clothing layers, foot warmers, heated stones, careful meal planning, and indoor entertainment became central to life. The wealthy had more options, but the cold did not discriminate entirely. Everyone, to varying degrees, participated in the slow, quiet endurance of frost, fog, and gray days. As we drift toward the next part, we'll explore some of the more extreme and curious adaptations, early heating contraptions, inventive survival hacks, and the occasional mildly absurd luxury designed purely to stave off winter misery. For now, imagine the scene. Children bundled like wool sausages, servants coordinating fires, families huddled near stoves, and everyone enduring winter with a mixture of practicality, humor, and quiet resignation.
Part 4. Eccentric heating devices and inventive winter hacks. Welcome back, friends. If you're still comfortably wrapped in a blanket, or at least imagining yourself that way, then you're perfectly set to drift into the more inventive side of Victorian winter survival. Because when the cold in London became relentless, people didn't just shiver quietly. They built devices, they tinkered, they invented slightly ridiculous contraptions designed to trap heat, warm feet, and occasionally amuse visiting guests. Let's start with stoves. Coal stoves were the standard, and Victorian engineers liked them complicated. Some had multiple compartments to control airflow. Others had cast iron elements designed to radiate heat evenly across a room. Many, however, had quirks. Open a vent wrong and you got smoke. Open it another way and your room remained a refrigerator with decorative iron bars. Users often learned these devices by trial and error, with mild amounts of soot inhalation. This is, of course, considered entirely acceptable by historical standards. Then there were foot warmers. These are delightful little metal boxes filled with glowing coals, sometimes with handles, sometimes without. People placed them under chairs, tables, or beds. Foot warmers were portable, which was excellent, except that they were also small, hot, and occasionally capable of starting fires if mishandled. In large households, foot warmers were passed around like communal treasure, and there was an unspoken hierarchy. The person closest to the hearth received the warmest foot warmer, while others did their best. Hot bricks were another common solution. They were wrapped in cloth and placed at the foot of beds or inside thick blankets. They retained heat surprisingly well, but occasionally rolled away in the night, resulting in very toasty toes, or, for the unlucky, very burnt toes. Hot bricks were practical, yet slightly perilous, a true Victorian compromise. A slightly fancier adaptation was the bed warmer, which was a pan with hot coals inside that a servant would slide between the sheets before bedtime. It was a small luxury, intended to make the first few minutes of sleep less of a frigid shock. Of course, one had to be careful not to overdo it, or the bed could catch fire. History notes that such accidents were rare, but memorable. Another eccentric invention was the heated footstool. Chairs with hollow compartments or small metal inserts allowed warmth to rise gently toward the seated person. It was a subtle luxury in parlors and drawing rooms, demonstrating that Victorians were capable of both creativity and mild paranoia about frostbite. For the truly inventive, there were central heating experiments. Some palaces and large homes attempted rudimentary steam or hot water systems to distribute heat. Piping ran through walls and floors, sometimes successfully, sometimes leaking, and occasionally producing a low, hissing sound that sounded slightly like a dragon sighing. Servants often oversaw these systems with equal parts diligence and mild terror. And then there were personal heating devices. gloves and socks sometimes had pockets for heated inserts, and some wealthy families experimented with tiny portable braziers. Imagine walking through a foggy London street, gloves stuffed with hot coals, occasionally waving your hands to prevent minor burns. It sounds absurd, but practicality often outweighed elegance. Now let's drift to window solutions. Windows in Victorian London were notoriously drafty. Wealthy households installed double layers of glass where possible, sometimes with curtains layered thickly to trap heat. Poorer families relied on fabric, newspapers, or cardboard to insulate. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked reasonably well. Windows, after all, were the weak link between warmth and sub-zero misery. Floors were another target for heating ingenuity. Rugs and carpets became essential, particularly thick ones placed over cold boards. Families often layered rugs in high-traffic areas, which served dual purposes: warmth and soot coverage. Because Victorian floors had a tendency to collect coal dust, mud, and the occasional stray animal foot. Layered rugs also doubled as low-effort cleaning strategy. Speaking of animals, pets were often bundled. Cats, dogs, and exotic animals were tucked near stoves or wrapped in blankets. One can imagine a monkey perched near a fire, occasionally judging the humans for their lack of efficiency in warmth management. Birds, meanwhile, were often housed near small stoves, fluttering nervously but enjoying slightly toasty cages. Victorian pets, in a sense, lived better winters than many human family members. Cooking was another form of warmth. Kitchens were hot, smoky, and slightly chaotic. Cooking over stoves or fireplaces produced incidental heat that spread into the adjoining rooms. Wealthier households used kitchens strategically. A simmering pot of soup or stew radiated warmth, provided nourishment, and occasionally perfumed the air in ways that distracted from the damp chill. Tea, of course, was central to survival. Hot drinks warmed both body and spirits, and the ritual of tea preparation became slightly ceremonial during winter months. Families gathered around teapots, sipping, sharing mild complaints about frostbite, and using cups as portable heaters for hands. Tea, it seems, was both comfort and social glue, a warm pause in otherwise gray, relentless winters. Clothing continued to play a role, especially indoors. Even in heated rooms, multiple layers remained standard. Wealthy adults wore woolens, silks, and furs, while children layered thick socks and gloves. Underwear were heavier than modern coats, and the occasional heated insert in clothing became a minor status symbol. Wearing warmth in visible, socially acceptable ways was both practical and fashionable. Transportation hacks were subtle but inventive. Carriage interiors were sometimes lined with fabric to trap heat, horses were blanketed, and drivers wore multiple layers. For those walking, scarves, gloves, and hats were essential. In particularly cold winters, people improvised by wrapping themselves in extra layers of cloaks, shawls, or blankets borrowed from friends. Fashion, practicality, and mild desperation intertwined seamlessly. And of course, there were social rituals around warmth. Parlors, drawing rooms, and sitting areas became zones of gentle competition. Who could sit closest to the fire, who could monopolize heated footrests, and who could avoid exposure to the drafty hallway. Even conversations subtly reflected the winter struggle. Mild complaints, stories of frostbite narrowly avoided, and occasional nostalgic exaggerations of summer warmth. And finally, let's not forget outdoor innovations. People improvised ways to walk through fog and ice without freezing. Thick boots, layered clothing, and strategic walking paths minimized exposure. Vendors in the streets sometimes carried small braziers, warming hands while selling goods. Children learned to navigate icy streets with slow, deliberate steps, often dragging small sleds or playing briefly on frozen ponds. Outdoor winter life demanded both creativity and patience. In essence, Victorian winters inspired a slow-motion ballet of adaptation. Stoves, foot warmers, heated bricks, layered clothing, insulated floors, and pets carefully positioned near heat sources.
Families coordinated warmth as a daily ritual, balancing practicality, creativity, and social etiquette. Survival was not merely about enduring cold. It was about orchestrating an environment that allowed life to continue, with minimal frostbite, occasional comfort, and just enough eccentricity to make the winter slightly bearable. As we gently prepare to drift into Part 5, we'll explore the social and emotional consequences of these winters, how the cold affected family dynamics, mental health, and even the occasional eccentric Victorian hobby. For now, imagine rooms filled with foot warmers, hot bricks, blankets, and the quiet hum of coal stoves, each household engaged in the delicate art of staying just barely comfortable in a relentlessly cold city.
Part 5. Family Dynamics and Quirky Winter Behaviors. Welcome back, friends. By now, you're likely settled into your blanket cocoon, or at least imagining yourself so, and ready to drift through the subtler, quieter consequences of Victorian winters. Because beyond the coal, foot warmers, and layered clothing, these long, gray months had a profound effect on family life, emotional health, and occasional eccentricity. Let's start with family dynamics. Victorian families were often large, and winter magnified the challenges of living in close quarters. A family of 6 or more in a 2-room flat meant constant negotiation for warmth. The room nearest the fireplace was the prized spot, and allocation of this thermal real estate could spark mild tensions. Parents often mediated with stoic patience, but children, naturally, were less patient. One can imagine whispered arguments over who gets the slightly warmer blanket or the comfier chair. It was domestic life distilled to a slow, cold-motion game of survival. The cold also influenced sleeping arrangements. Beds were strategically positioned near heat sources, and children sometimes shared mattresses to conserve warmth. This close proximity encouraged bonding, mild irritability, and occasional accidental kicking incidents. Wealthier families had larger bedrooms and multiple beds, but even then, drafts and uneven heating meant that frostbite or discomfort remained a quiet threat. Nighttime was as much about managing temperature as it was about sleep itself. Meals became an emotional centerpiece. Hot food was comforting, filling, and slightly competitive. Families would gather around the hearth or kitchen, savoring soups, stews, and porridge while exchanging minor complaints about frostbite, cold toes, or the fog outside. Conversation often revolved around weather updates, small domestic victories, or subtle boasts about who had the warmest layer. Food was practical, yes, but also emotional. A daily reminder that survival required collaboration and gentle compromise. Children developed their own strategies for coping. Winter play was brief and deliberate. Sledding, ice skating, and outdoor games were common, but short-lived. Gloves were thick, scarves muffled faces, and coats limited mobility, which made snowball fights more like carefully negotiated snow exchanges. Indoors, games, drawing, and music became the primary forms of entertainment. The cold transformed daily life into a series of small, careful, and occasionally creative rituals designed to maintain warmth, morale, and attention spans. Eccentric behaviors emerged as well. Some families experimented with micro-heating zones within rooms, creating pockets of warmth by strategically arranging furniture, stoves, and blankets. Others developed elaborate foot warmer sharing systems, ensuring that the warmest metal boxes reached the most deserving family members first. These behaviors were functional, but they also reflected subtle social hierarchies and the human capacity for mild obsession with comfort. Let's drift toward emotional impacts. Long winters in foggy gray London affected mood and mental health. Journals and letters from the period often mention lethargy, irritability, and a persistent sense of endurance rather than enjoyment. People adjusted socially, spending more time indoors, cultivating quieter hobbies, and relying on small comforts: tea, hot baths, rare, blankets, and brief sunlight when it appeared.
The cold, damp environment reinforced a sense of routine, patience, and mild melancholy, a backdrop to daily life that was both humbling and quietly omnipresent. Even the wealthy, accustomed to multiple fireplaces and extensive furs, experienced mild winter-induced gloom. Palaces were large, drafty, and difficult to heat evenly. Staff were occupied with maintaining stoves, lighting fires, and distributing warmth, which meant that residents often felt mildly cold despite every possible luxury. One can imagine Queen Victoria sipping tea by a fire, wrapped in furs, while the distant echoes of icy hallways reminded her that wealth did not equal immunity to winter discomfort. Pets, predictably, were affected emotionally as well. Dogs, cats, and exotic animals sought out warmth, often crowding near stoves, fireplaces, or heated beds. Monkeys, if kept as pets, might have perched on furniture near fires, watching humans carefully while judging the slow distribution of warmth. Birds occasionally huddled in cages near stoves. Animals in a way mirrored the subtle anxiety, patience, and routines of their human companions. Let's consider social behaviors. Visiting friends and neighbors was more challenging during winter months because fog, ice, and cold made travel unpleasant. Indoor gatherings increased, often revolving around warmth and mild entertainment. Families played cards, listened to music, or engaged in a conversation that alternated between polite complaint and gentle humor about frostbitten toes or drafty rooms. Winter subtly reshaped social life. Shorter distances, smaller groups, and a focus on indoor comfort over outdoor spectacle. Education, too, adapted. Schools continued operation despite cold, drafty classrooms. Children shivered through lessons, wrapped in woolens and blankets where permitted. Teachers maintained authority while wrapped in layers, relying on small stoves where possible. Lessons were quieter, more subdued, and occasionally punctuated by coughing fits or sneezing. Winter subtly dictated the rhythm of learning, encouraging calm, patience, and mild endurance among both students and staff. Family hobbies also reflected adaptation. Knitting, sewing, and other quiet crafts flourished. Music, drawing, and reading became essential entertainment. Even reading by the fire required strategic positioning. Too far, and the room was cold. Too close, and soot from the fireplace threatened books or fingers. Victorian families cultivated a delicate balance between warmth, comfort, and productive indoor activity, creating a unique rhythm dictated by the season. Some households developed more unusual eccentricities. For example, certain families would maintain small heated corners for individual members, allowing each person a personal warmth zone. Others experimented with reflective devices, mirrors, or strategically placed metal objects to trap heat from stoves. These practices were subtle, inventive, and slightly obsessive, reflecting the human drive to adapt, survive, and occasionally display ingenuity in the face of inconvenience. Health remained a persistent concern. Cold dampness exacerbated existing illnesses, and new ailments emerged with the season. Pneumonia, bronchitis, and minor frostbite were common, though families rarely panicked. Preventative measures included layers, hot drinks, foot warmers, and careful monitoring of children and elderly family members. Victorian winter survival was less about heroic effort and more about sustained vigilance, slow adaptation, and mild ingenuity. Even leisure reflected the season. Indoor gatherings, storytelling, and gentle games became central to family life. Ice skating and sledding continued briefly outdoors, but always with caution. Children learned to appreciate short bursts of play while remaining mindful of cold exposure. Adults adjusted routines, embraced smaller social circles, and occasionally employed humor, sarcasm, or gentle complaint as a form of psychological relief. In short, winter life shaped the rhythm of domestic existence. Daily routines, meals, education, hobbies, and social interactions were all subtly recalibrated. Families balanced warmth, nutrition, and mild entertainment against the persistent gray chill. Emotional endurance was required as much as physical survival. The cold dictated behaviors, prompted creative solutions, and quietly molded the social and emotional landscape of Victorian households. As we gently prepare for Part 6, we'll drift into even more peculiar adaptations, specific household inventions, mildly absurd personal heating devices, and the eccentric solutions that only Victorian ingenuity could produce. For now, imagine a room where the family gathers around a fireplace, blankets layered, tea in hand, pets crowding near heat sources, and every conversation shaded with a soft undertone of frost awareness and mild, patient humor.
Part 6. Bizarre Victorian Winter Inventions. Welcome back, friends. By now, you're probably wrapped in a blanket, or at least imagining yourself snug, which is perfect, because we're about to drift into the more curious side of Victorian winter life. The Victorians were inventive, persistent, and occasionally absurd in their attempts to stay warm. Their gadgets and devices reflect a subtle blend of practicality, eccentricity, and mild obsession. Let's start with the personal stove, a small portable coal-fired contraption designed to warm a single person. These were sometimes encased in metal, sometimes in ceramic, and occasionally in something that resembled a small cage. Users could hold them, place them under blankets, or situate them near their feet. They were charmingly inefficient by modern standards, occasionally smoky, and occasionally hot enough to singe a finger. But they provided a psychological sense of control over one's warmth, a tiny triumph against the relentless chill of winter. Then there were heated bedboards and bedchamber accessories. Bedboards, in particular, were designed to elevate a thin mattress above a gentle heat source, often coals or heated stones, allowing warmth to rise into the sleeper. Some devices were elaborate, with vents and small metal compartments, while others were delightfully simple. A brick warmed on the stove, wrapped in cloth, and placed under the covers. Children frequently appropriated these for playful purposes, turning warmth into a game of careful maneuvering and minor accidental burns. Let's not forget the heated gloves and socks, sometimes lined with flannel or padded with small heated inserts. The Victorians were not shy about taking warmth seriously. Wealthy individuals might carry heated gloves while walking outside, waving hands occasionally to prevent minor burns. It seems absurd to modernize, but in the grey, foggy streets of London, even the smallest comfort was a victory. One particularly charming invention was the warming pan, which could be placed under tables or chairs. Guests would gather around, feet tucked near these small heat sources, creating temporary microclimates of mild comfort. In some households, these were elaborate affairs, metal boxes with handles, perforated lids, and occasionally protective screens. They were portable, communal, and slightly precarious, because warmth often came with the risk of fire, soot, or mild scalding. The Victorians also experimented with clothing-integrated heating. Some coats and trousers had pockets designed to hold small heated inserts. Boots occasionally contained warm pads, and shawls sometimes had hidden compartments for heat-retaining devices. These adaptations were functional, slightly cumbersome, and a subtle indicator of social status. The wealthier you were, the more intricate and slightly ridiculous your personal heating systems could be. Floor heating, rudimentary by modern standards, also appeared in larger homes. Layers of rugs over boards trapped heat from stoves, while some experimental systems used pipes to circulate steam beneath floors. Servants monitored these systems closely, occasionally scolding each other for improper coal placement or minor leaks. It was a slow, subtle ballet of heat distribution, where efficiency, patience, and mild paranoia were required for success. Windows, as always, were a weak point. The Victorian solution involved thick curtains, additional panes where possible, and sometimes even cardboard or fabric insulation. Drafts were common, and the layering of materials became almost ceremonial. Wealthy families treated windows as part of the heating system, occasionally adjusting blinds, curtains, and decorative coverings to optimize temperature without compromising elegance. Pets received a surprising amount of attention in this context. Cats and dogs often had heated pads, blankets, or designated areas near stoves. Exotic animals, monkeys, birds, small mammals, were carefully positioned to receive warmth while remaining under surveillance. In some cases, heated cages or small hearths were constructed exclusively for pets, demonstrating both practical concern and mild eccentricity. Vehicles had adaptations. Carriage interiors were sometimes padded, lined with fabric, or equipped with small stoves. Drivers and passengers layered clothing, gloves, and scarves. Horses were blanketed, sometimes in multiple layers, to maintain energy and warmth. Walking, of course, required improvisation, thick boots, gloves, and the occasional borrowed blanket. The outdoors in this period demanded ingenuity, patience, and a subtle tolerance for absurdity. Let's drift to kitchen innovations. Cooking itself provided incidental warmth. Large stoves radiated heat, warming kitchens, adjacent rooms, and occasionally guests who lingered too long. Some families strategically scheduled cooking to coincide with peak cold hours, ensuring that the room's warmth lasted as long as possible. Soup, stew, and porridge were staples, partially for nutrition and partially because slow simmering dishes produced ambient heat for an extended period. Tea and other hot beverages played both practical and psychological roles. Ritualized preparation became part of the daily rhythm, providing warmth, comfort, and gentle entertainment. Hot drinks were sipped slowly near fires, occasionally combined with storytelling, reading, or card games. These practices reinforced domestic routines and subtly mitigated the monotony of gray, cold days. Clothing, of course, complemented devices. Wool layers, fur, and silk were combined with heated inserts, foot warmers, and personal stoves. Even indoors, layers remained essential. Wealthy individuals sometimes wore indoor coats or fur-lined garments to ensure comfort while moving through drafty rooms. Fashion and practicality intertwined, producing a subtle elegance that doubled as mild survivalism. One particularly quirky practice involved reflective devices. Mirrors, polished metal, and even strategic furniture placement were used to direct heat from stoves or fireplaces into desired areas. These subtle interventions demonstrated creativity, patience, and mild obsession with efficiency. The Victorians were not shy about experimenting, even if the results were occasionally amusing or slightly hazardous. Floor rugs continued to play a critical role. In some households, layers of carpets or mats created warm zones for high-traffic areas. Heat retention, dust and soot coverage, and general comfort were all addressed simultaneously. Family members quickly learned which rugs were warmest, where to position chairs, and how to maximize their thermal advantage without disturbing others. It was a domestic life redefined by winter, subtly inventive and quietly amusing. In essence, Victorian winter survival was a delicate balance of devices, clothing, spatial strategy, and creativity. Foot warmers, heated bricks, stoves, insulated floors, and reflective techniques all played a role. Families coordinated warmth like a slow, deliberate dance, combining practicality with mild eccentricity. Pets, clothing, and social rituals were all integrated into this careful orchestration. The result was a city filled with inventive, slightly absurd solutions to a persistent gray chill. As we gently prepare for Part 7, we'll drift toward the psychological and emotional quirks that emerged from these winters, including coping strategies, rituals, and subtle humor in domestic life. For now, imagine rooms filled with stoves, foot warmers, heated bricks, layered rugs, reflective devices, and family members quietly orchestrating their own comfort in the relentless fog and chill of London. Part 7. Mental Resilience and Domestic Rituals. Welcome back, friends. By now, you're likely settled into your blanket cocoon, with perhaps a warm drink in hand, ready to drift deeper into the quieter, subtler side of Victorian winters. Because beyond the layers of clothing, foot warmers, and stoves, there existed an equally important aspect of survival: the mind. Long winters required psychological endurance, small domestic rituals, and a gentle, dry humor to survive the gray monotony. Let's start with daily routines. Routines became essential for structure and comfort. Meals, tea breaks, and reading sessions were ritualized, providing predictability in an otherwise gray and damp season. Children were taught schedules: wake, dress in layers, eat, study indoors, briefly play, and repeat. These patterns were quietly comforting, creating small islands of normalcy against the backdrop of frost, fog, and occasional soot. The Victorians were also adept at mild humor. Diaries and letters reveal subtle sarcasm about the cold, the drafty houses, and the inefficiency of heating devices. The fire is mercifully warm, though the hallway persists in its icy conspiracy against our toes. Humor was never loud or boisterous. It was soft, dry, and perfectly suited for quiet contemplation by the hearth. Families developed personal rituals to manage mood. Some involved arranging furniture in precise ways to maximize warmth. Others involve rotation of foot warmers, heated bricks, or stoves between rooms and occupants. Children often created their own rituals, tucking pets near fires, stacking blankets, or experimenting with inventive ways to retain heat. These small routines provided a sense of agency in an environment largely dictated by cold, damp weather. Mental endurance also manifested in social interactions. Indoor gatherings were quieter, more deliberate, and often subtly competitive in terms of thermal advantage. Guests would strategically position themselves near stoves, slightly distance themselves from drafty windows, and occasionally make mild commentary on who had secured the warmest chair. Conversation revolved around minor triumphs: a successfully heated bed, a well-warmed foot, or a brief period of sunlight catching a carpet just right. The foggy gray outdoors also shaped mental resilience. Streets of London were perpetually misted in winter, and people learned to navigate with patience and quiet observation. The cold slowed movement, encouraged careful consideration, and allowed for subtle appreciation of routine. Walking to school, to market, or to social visits became exercises in mindfulness, wrapped in scarves and gloves, shuffling carefully over icy cobblestones. Pets, predictably, contributed to psychological well-being. Cats and dogs huddled near fires, providing warmth and gentle companionship. Birds chirped from their heated cages, occasionally fluttering to remind humans of life beyond frost and fog. Exotic pets, when present, added mild amusement or distraction, offering curiosity and engagement during long indoor stretches. In this way, animals were both companions and subtle contributors to emotional endurance. Music and arts also played a role. Indoor entertainment, piano playing, singing, drawing, and reading aloud became vital rituals. Families would gather around stoves, sharing stories, music, or minor games that occupied time and soothed spirits. Reading, particularly by the fire, offered both distraction and mental stimulation. Poetry, novels, and periodicals circulated among households, subtly shaping imagination and morale in the midst of gray, cold months. Exercise, though limited by the chill, was incorporated subtly. Children might play briefly in courtyards, run errands, or move about indoors. Adults performed gentle stretching, household chores, or brisk walks in layered clothing. These small movements promoted warmth, prevented stiffness, and offered a psychological sense of control over one's environment. Winter was a test of patience, creativity, and endurance. Let's consider mild eccentricities. Some families developed elaborate routines to manage heat distribution, rotating stoves, periodically moving foot warmers, or placing reflective devices to direct warmth. Each household had its own variations, often slightly absurd, but entirely functional. Wealthy families sometimes indulged in more decorative or complex devices, while poorer families relied on clever improvisation, layers of newspapers, cardboard insulation, or strategic blanket placement. Food rituals also contributed to mental resilience. Soup, stew, and porridge were not merely sustenance, they were comforting routines. Families scheduled meal preparation to coincide with the coldest parts of the day, maximizing heat and aroma. Tea breaks offered a gentle pause, a moment to gather warmth, sip slowly, and engage in soft conversation. Meals became emotional anchors, offering reassurance amid the relentless chill. Communication and letter writing became winter habits. With travel less appealing, people relied on letters to maintain social connections. Journals and diaries chronicled daily life, mild annoyances, and subtle observations about the cold. Writing was therapeutic, reinforcing routines and offering a private space for humor, complaint, or reflection. The gray months encouraged introspection, careful planning, and gentle creativity. Education adapted psychologically as well. Children in poorly heated classrooms learned patience, quiet focus, and mild stoicism. Teachers, wrapped in layers, encouraged adherence to routine. Lessons were sometimes punctuated by coughs, shivers, or brief complaints about icy fingers, yet learning continued. Winter cultivated endurance, discipline, and subtle adaptability in students and teachers alike. Even decorative elements had functional purposes. Thick curtains, layered rugs, and wall hangings were aesthetically pleasing, but also provided warmth. Positioning furniture near stoves, draping blankets over chairs, or creating cozy corners became minor domestic rituals. These practices subtly reinforced mental resilience, giving occupants a sense of control and comfort despite environmental discomfort. Let's not forget subtle entertainment rituals. Card games, storytelling, and quiet games of strategy filled hours. Children created miniature theaters, drawing or crafting small figures for indoor play. Adults engaged in puzzles, reading aloud, or gentle music making. These activities maintained engagement, offered mild diversion, and reinforced social bonds, all while preserving warmth and minimizing exposure to the cold. Sleep itself was ritualized. Heated bricks, foot warmers, and thick blankets ensured the first moments in bed were bearable. Nighttime schedules balanced warmth and comfort. Beds were arranged near stoves, layers adjusted carefully, and pets often shared the foot of the bed. Sleep became both a necessity and a managed activity, combining physical warmth with psychological comfort. In essence, Victorian winter life demanded mental endurance, domestic creativity, and subtle humor. Families orchestrated warmth through clothing, devices, furniture, and ritualized routines. Children, adults, and pets all participated in this quiet ballet of survival. Humor remained gentle and dry, routines provided structure, and domestic rituals offered both practical and emotional support. As we gently drift toward Part 8, we'll explore seasonal traditions, mild eccentricities in wealthy households, and peculiar winter hobbies that arose specifically to endure long gray winters. For now, imagine a quiet evening. The family gathered near stoves, blankets layered, teacups warm,
pets snuggled, and everyone quietly participating in the small, deliberate art of mental and physical winter survival.
Part 8. Seasonal Traditions and Eccentric Winter Hobbies. Welcome back, friends. If you're still snug, or at least imagining yourself so, let's drift gently into the quieter, slightly peculiar cultural side of Victorian winters. Beyond layered clothing, heated bricks, and subtle domestic rituals, winter also inspired traditions, hobbies, and mild eccentricities that helped families pass the grey months with patience and sometimes with gentle amusement. Let's begin with seasonal festivities. Christmas, of course, was central. Trees were decorated, candles placed carefully to avoid fire hazards, and gifts exchanged with quiet excitement. Unlike modern spectacles, Victorian celebrations were often intimate, domestic, and subtly elaborate. Families planned meals, decorations, and small performances indoors, prioritizing warmth while still maintaining a sense of occasion. Even in chilly rooms, the soft glow of candles, fireplaces, and carefully managed lamps provided a gentle, comforting atmosphere. Gift-giving had its own peculiarities. Handmade items were common: knitted socks, embroidered handkerchiefs, and simple toys. Wealthier households might provide small mechanical novelties or delicate figurines, often requiring careful handling in drafty parlours. Children approached these gifts with excitement, but always tempered by the mild discomfort of cold toes or stiff fingers, a reminder that winter persisted outside, as even festivities unfolded inside. Winter hobbies reflected both practicality and gentle eccentricity. Knitting, sewing, embroidery, and other crafts were common, providing warmth, activity, and mental engagement. Adults produced clothing, household items, or decorative works, while children learned these skills as both entertainment and instruction. The repetitive nature of these tasks suited the season: quiet, focused, and productive, yet not strenuous enough to overheat small stoves or fireplaces. Music played a subtle role. Pianos, violins, and singing provided indoor entertainment, often performed near stoves or fires for warmth. Family members gathered, alternating between quiet observation and gentle participation. Music filled drafty rooms with sound, creating a psychological warmth that complemented the physical warmth of layered clothing and carefully placed heating devices. Reading was another central pastime. Libraries, book collections, and periodicals offered both education and entertainment. Chairs were positioned near stoves or windows, blankets draped over laps, and foot warmers occasionally placed nearby. The rhythm of reading, pausing to sip tea or observe falling snow outside, provided structure to otherwise grey, slow days. Journals, diaries, and letters allowed reflection, storytelling, and subtle humour, reinforcing the gentle cadence of indoor winter life. Some families indulged in more eccentric hobbies. Miniature theatres, puppet shows, and small indoor games occupied children for hours. Adults sometimes experimented with mild scientific curiosities, growing small plants indoors, monitoring temperatures in different rooms, or tinkering with personal heating devices. These activities were quietly inventive, providing both engagement and subtle amusement, and occasionally revealing gentle competition between family members or neighbours. Ice skating and sledding persisted outdoors, albeit briefly and cautiously. Children bundled in thick layers, played in small, managed doses, retreating quickly to warmth when toes or fingers became uncomfortably cold. Adults often supervised, occasionally participating, but always mindful of the grey fog, slippery surfaces, and persistent chill. Outdoor play, like all winter activities, required patience, endurance, and subtle observation of frostbite risks. Let's not forget mild social rituals. Indoor visits, teas, and gatherings allowed families to share warmth collectively. Guests rotated foot warmers, shared blankets, and subtly competed for proximity to stoves. Conversation gently oscillated between polite complaint, mild humour, and shared observations about the weather, health, and domestic strategies. These interactions reinforced social bonds while maintaining the quiet endurance demanded by winter. Holidays and festivals were slightly adapted to the season. Winter fairs, indoor performances, and brief outdoor excursions combined entertainment with caution. Wealthier families might enjoy more elaborate indoor celebrations, while others relied on intimate domestic traditions. In all cases, the persistent grey outside shaped the rhythm, scope, and execution of seasonal events. Animal companions often participated in seasonal traditions. Cats, dogs, and other pets were gently incorporated into household routines, sometimes wearing small festive accessories or positioned near warmth during gatherings. Their presence contributed subtly to morale, offering both comfort and quiet amusement. Even exotic pets occasionally became minor participants in mild domestic celebrations. Cooking also became a seasonal ritual. Winter stews, roasts, and baked goods not only provided warmth and nutrition, but also structured the day. Baking in particular offered both heat and aroma, creating comforting environments for family members. Recipes were repeated, shared, and sometimes adapted, reflecting both practical needs and subtle domestic creativity. Games and quiet competitions flourished indoors. Card games, board games, and strategy exercises allowed families to engage socially while remaining safely indoors. Children sometimes devised small indoor challenges, testing patience, creativity, and dexterity while bundled in layers. Adults occasionally joined, combining mild amusement with gentle competition over warmth, strategy, or minor victories. Finally, let's consider the quiet humour embedded in these traditions. Victorian families developed soft sarcasms, subtle jests, and gentle observational humour about frost, drafty rooms, or inefficient heating devices. Letters and diaries often included wry commentary. "The fire refuses to cooperate with my toes today," or "The cat has claimed the warmest corner as usual." These observations were never loud or dramatic. They were dry, gentle, and perfectly suited to quiet evenings by the hearth. In essence, Victorian winters cultivated domestic creativity, mild eccentricity, and subtle emotional resilience. Seasonal traditions, indoor hobbies, social rituals, and gentle humour allowed families to navigate grey months with structure, warmth, and psychological endurance. Pets, music, crafts, and reading all contributed to a balanced rhythm, quietly reinforcing both practical survival and emotional well-being. As we drift towards part 9, we'll explore the impact of winter on health, fashion, and urban life, including minor eccentricities, peculiar adaptations, and the subtle interplay between status, comfort, and endurance. For now, imagine a quiet evening. Families knitting, reading, playing gentle games, teacups steaming, pets nestled near foot warmers, and the persistent fog of London softly pressing against windows, while indoor life unfolds with patient and gentle purpose.
Part 9. Health, Fashion, and Urban Adaptations in Victorian Winters. Welcome back, friends. By now, you're likely cocooned in blankets or imagining yourself so, ready to drift further into the subtler nuances of Victorian winter life. Beyond domestic rituals, pets, and eccentric hobbies, winter shaped health, fashion, and urban living in ways that were simultaneously practical, peculiar, and occasionally amusing. Let's start with health. Cold and damp were constant companions, and Victorians were acutely aware of their effects. Respiratory ailments were common. Coughs, colds, bronchitis, and occasional pneumonia were persistent threats, particularly for children and the elderly. Families developed subtle preventative measures, layered clothing, warm drinks, and careful management of stoves and fires. Hospitals and doctors offered advice, some practical, some mildly odd, emphasizing moderation, warmth, and patience. Nutrition played a central role in winter health. Root vegetables, preserved meats, porridges, and soups dominated daily diets, providing calories to maintain warmth. Wealthier households supplemented with roasted meats, puddings, and occasional delicacies. Hot drinks, especially tea, were consumed religiously, not merely for flavor, but for mild, portable warmth. Families learned to balance sustenance with practicality, because cold days demanded more energy for mere survival. Fashion, of course, adapted subtly to winter realities. Layers were essential. Woolen undergarments, thick socks, heavy dresses, coats, and furs became standard indoors as well as outdoors. Wealthier individuals experimented with insulated fabrics, lined cloaks, and heated accessories. Gloves, hats, and scarves were carefully coordinated, both for warmth and social appearance. Victorian fashion combined elegance with endurance, subtly reflecting social status and personal ingenuity. Footwear deserves a gentle mention. Thick boots, often layered with fabric, were standard. Streets were icy, muddy, and occasionally treacherous, so practical footwear was essential. The wealthy sometimes wore elaborately lined boots, while middle and lower-class families relied on multiple pairs of layered shoes or makeshift solutions. Every step outside was a careful negotiation between warmth, mobility, and minor dignity. Urban adaptations were similarly practical. Streets were foggy, damp, and cold. Vendors set up small braziers to warm hands while selling goods. Walkways were coated with ash, straw, or sand to reduce slipperiness. Carriage interiors were padded, horses were blanketed, and drivers layered clothing. Pedestrians improvised with multiple scarves, shawls, and gloves, navigating gray streets with deliberate and cautious steps. The city itself became a theater of endurance, subtly structured around warmth, mobility, and minor improvisation. Heating solutions in urban life varied. Public buildings, markets, theaters, and churches struggled with drafts and poor insulation. Coal stoves and fireplaces were the primary means of heating, but smoke, soot, and uneven warmth were unavoidable. People developed strategies, sitting near stoves, layering clothing, or timing visits to coincide with warmer periods of the day. Urban winters demanded patience, coordination, and a subtle appreciation for microclimates created by fires in enclosed spaces. Health advice often included mild eccentricities. Doctors sometimes recommended warm foot baths before bedtime, frequent tea consumption, or lightly wrapped heated stones in beds. These measures were more preventive than curative, aiming to reduce minor illnesses while promoting comfort. Families adopted these recommendations with varying degrees of diligence, often blending practical strategies with gentle superstition or habit. Children's health routines adapted to winter as well. Schools, despite cold and drafty classrooms, continued operation. Layered clothing, periodic exercise, and brief outdoor play were combined to maintain well-being. Teachers monitored attendance, ensuring that mild colds or shivers did not escalate. Children learned early the subtle art of pacing themselves, when to play, when to retreat indoors, and how to navigate layered clothing while maintaining engagement in lessons and activities. Let's consider mild social adaptations. Wealthier households often hosted indoor gatherings to avoid harsh outdoor conditions. Drawing rooms, parlors, and conservatories became spaces for social endurance. Conversation, music, card games, and observation of warmth hierarchies. Guests quietly observed who occupied stoves, foot warmers, or heated chairs, and social etiquette subtly reinforced both comfort and hierarchy. Even humor, gentle and dry, played a role in navigating shared warmth and minor inconveniences. Urban fashion also reflected status and adaptation. Gloves, scarves, and hats were carefully maintained. Coats were layered and lined. Heated inserts, where affordable, became subtle indicators of wealth or ingenuity. Footwear and outer garments were chosen not only for elegance, but for practical survival. Public appearances, social rituals, and commerce were all subtly influenced by the cold, demonstrating the interplay between environment, fashion, and social norms. Let's drift toward domestic architecture. Windows remained a challenge, drafty and often poorly insulated. Families used heavy curtains, fabric, cardboard, and sometimes creative layering to reduce heat loss. Floors were layered with rugs and carpets to retain warmth. Furniture placement reflected heating priorities. Chairs near stoves, tables positioned to maximize reflected heat, and beds arranged with careful attention to proximity to warm areas. Homes became miniature ecosystems of thermal strategy. Entertainment, as usual, adapted subtly. Theater, music, indoor games, reading, and mild craft activities occupied winter hours. Children and adults alike relied on layered clothing, heated bricks, foot warmers, and proximity to stoves. Pets were positioned strategically. Indoor life was a careful balance of warmth, engagement, and gentle endurance, punctuated by subtle humor, domestic creativity, and occasional minor frustrations with imperfect heating. Finally, health-conscious rituals extended to food, exercise, and clothing maintenance. Families prepared warm meals strategically, layered clothing carefully, and encouraged minor movement indoors to circulate warmth. Pet care, window insulation, and management of foot warmers became everyday priorities. Victorian winters required coordinated domestic effort, subtle patience, and mild creativity, a continuous negotiation between human comfort, environmental reality, and social expectation. In essence, winter in Victorian London shaped every aspect of life: health, fashion, urban navigation, domestic routines, and subtle social dynamics. Physical survival intertwined with psychological endurance, domestic ingenuity, and gentle humor. Streets, homes, schools, and social spaces were all subtly adapted to mitigate cold, damp, and fog, demonstrating resilience, creativity, and mild obsession with comfort. As we gently prepare for Part 10, the final section, we'll drift toward the quiet culmination of winter routines, the persistence of domestic ingenuity, and the subtle and enduring charm of surviving gray months in Victorian London. For now, imagine a city of layered streets, cautious pedestrians, puffing stoves, heavily dressed children, and homes orchestrating warmth with patient, deliberate care. Part 10. Reflections on Winter Survival and the Subtle Charm of Victorian Life. Welcome back, friends, to the final drift through our Victorian winter journey. By now, you're likely wrapped in blankets with a cup of something warm in hand, gently imagining the gray fog outside London's streets. Let's slowly float to the conclusion, reflecting on how winter shaped daily life, domestic ingenuity, subtle humor, and the quiet endurance of Victorian households. Winter, as we've seen, was never just a season. It was a framework for existence. From the drafty streets to the fog-enshrouded homes, every aspect of life was influenced by cold, damp, and gray light. Heating devices, foot warmers, layered clothing, rugs, and carefully placed furniture orchestrated survival with quiet ceremony. Families coordinated warmth like an elaborate, slow-moving ballet, blending practical survival with subtle invention, patience, and mild obsession. Domestic routines became more than habit.
They were survival strategies. Meals, tea breaks, crafts, music, and reading sessions all structured days into predictable rhythms. These routines provided psychological comfort as well as physical warmth. Children learned early the art of patience, gentle endurance, and mild creativity. Adults maintained the delicate balance of household management, social interaction, and personal comfort, orchestrating life around the persistent chill of winter. Pets played subtle but essential roles. Cats, dogs, birds, and even exotic animals occupied strategic positions near stoves, foot warmers, and heated corners. Their presence offered companionship, warmth, and gentle amusement. In many ways, animals participated in the slow domestic choreography, reinforcing both comfort and emotional resilience. Seasonal traditions, though simpler than modern extravagance, added charm and distraction. Christmas, indoor games, music, and reading all punctuated the long months with gentle ceremony. Crafts, miniature theaters, and subtle household experiments occupied minds and bodies alike. Families developed minor eccentricities, from reflective heat devices to heated inserts in clothing, blending practicality with creativity and a touch of whimsical curiosity. Health and fashion intertwined delicately with winter realities. Layered clothing, insulated footwear, and careful management of warmth devices mitigated illness and discomfort. Nutrition, exercise, and sleep routines reinforced physical endurance. Urban navigation, from icy streets to foggy walkways, demanded careful observation, layered clothing, and gentle patience. In all cases, survival required a slow, deliberate balance of effort, ingenuity, and social cooperation. Humor remained soft, dry, and essential. Diaries, letters, and conversation reveal subtle sarcasm. "The fire has conspired against me again," or "the cat has claimed the warmest brick, as usual." These remarks were never loud. They were gentle reminders that even in gray, difficult winters, humans found space for mild amusement and quiet commentary. Humor softened the monotony, provided companionship, and reinforced subtle social bonds. Winter also shaped imagination. Reading, storytelling, music, and indoor play allowed minds to drift beyond gray streets and drafty rooms. Creative hobbies, gentle games, and small domestic inventions encouraged innovation and patience. The season, though relentless, cultivated resilience, ingenuity, and subtle appreciation for minor comforts. A warm brick, a well-placed foot warmer, or a brief sunbeam through a window. Finally, winter in Victorian London was a testament to quiet endurance. Families, children, pets, and even urban infrastructure adapted continuously, blending survival, comfort, and subtle delight. The city, homes, and people moved in harmony with seasonal realities, orchestrating life around warmth, routine, and gentle humor. Every layer of clothing, every rotated foot warmer, every careful hearth placement contributed to a slow, deliberate, and enduring rhythm. As we close this long, calm journey, imagine the scene one last time. A quiet room, blankets layered, a stove softly glowing, tea steaming gently in cups, pets nestled at feet, and the faint fog pressing against windows. Conversations drift in soft tones, laughter is minimal, smiles subtle. Every action, every habit, every small invention reflects centuries of adaptation, patience, and quiet ingenuity. Victorian winters were brutal, yes, but also deeply human. They reveal endurance, creativity, subtle humor, and a gentle and persistent choreography of survival. They remind us that comfort is often a matter of patience, observation, and small, deliberate acts. And as we finally drift toward the end of our tale, we can appreciate the slow, enduring charm of life orchestrated around frost, fog, and the delicate art of staying just barely warm. So dim your lights, sip the last of your warm beverage, and let the memory of drafty rooms, foot warmers, heated bricks, layered clothing, and gentle domestic rituals settle softly in your mind. Victorian winters might have been gray, cold, and persistent, but they were also quietly inventive, subtly amusing, and profoundly human. And with that, we gently close our journey through the long, slow, and remarkably patient months of winter in Victorian London. Sleep well.